You're currently $600 million in debt. No?
1.2 billion.
1.2 billion, okay. There we go.
I do not like what you're saying, and you're painting it only in one direction.
And the money became debt. And so then these communist school teachers.
Robert Kiyosaki teaches people to be millionaires.
Best-selling author
Robert Kiyosaki.
Robert Kiyosaki.
Robert Kiyosaki.
One of the reasons I consider a direct selling business a perfect business is very simply because the company will work with you to get the business skills that make you rich. Always remember that it's not money that makes you rich, it's business skills.
Hello everyone, welcome to WeFIRE. I'm your host Jenny, and today's video is going to be a little different from usual. While researching for another video, I ran into an interesting podcast interview with this guy called Robert Kiyosaki.
You can go talk about whatever you want to talk about. I want to talk about what I know about.
Well, it's supposed to be an interview. And I'm trying to give a little context to my viewers.
I don't want to talk about Donald Trump in 1971. If you read my books, because I don't think you have, I don't really want to do this interview anymore.
Like most people, I know Robert Kiyosaki from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Also, like most people, I thought of Robert Kiyosaki as an upstanding and trustworthy sort of person. Someone who wanted to help people better their lives and escape the thankless, ceaseless grind of school, work, and debt. This podcast, though, Robert Kiyosaki came off as arrogant and rude, which didn't sit right with me. Ever since then, I've been digging, and soon realized the rabbit hole went far deeper than I ever could have guessed. Just who is Robert Kiyosaki? And can we trust him to have our best interests at heart? Robert Kiyosaki was born on April 8, 1947 in Hilo, Hawaii. World War II had just concluded, and the Cold War was primed to begin. Communism is a creeping evil, and capitalism is superior in all ways. Following his graduation from Hilo High in 1965, military tenure from 1969 to 1973, a bachelor's in science, and a 2-year MBA, Robert Kiyosaki made his first foray into entrepreneurship.
Do you remember these here? These are nylon and Velcro surfer wallets. When I was 26, I began marketing these products worldwide.
Robert Kiyosaki founded a company called Ripper that sold Velcro surfer wallets. As far as I can tell, the venture went under within a year. Not to be deterred, in 1992, Robert Kiyosaki, alongside his co-author Hal Zena Bennett, published his first book, If You Want to Be Rich and Happy, Don't Go to School. It was a smashing success. Sales soared and royalties rolled in. Turns out it was not through investment or business that Robert Kiyosaki would make his fortune, but in teaching other people about financial literacy. Robert Kiyosaki officially retires at the age of 47, only 2 years after publishing his first book. Between the ages of 1992 and 1997, Robert Kiyosaki took things easy. He attended seminars and read books to keep his mind sharp. Every now and again, Robert and Kim Kiyosaki would travel, delivering talks and seminars to eager listeners around the world. In 1997, Robert Kiyosaki, with the help of his second co-author, Sharon Letcher, came out with his second book, The Myth, The Legend, the best-selling personal finance book of all time. Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And the rest, so they say, is history.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
His book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
This book is on numerous lists as the best-selling personal finance book of all time.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad is the tale of two fathers, one being Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki's own father, Ralph Kiyosaki, the other being Rich Dad, Robert Kiyosaki's best friend's dad. Originally self-published in 1997, Rich Dad, Poor Dad will go on to be picked up by Plata Publishing for a second release in 2000. This book will go on to sell a jaw-dropping 40 million plus copies. So what lessons does Rich Dad, Poor Dad teach?
Hey guys, editing Jenny here. So when I got to this section, I realized that I spent way too long going over the details of Rich Dad Poor Dad that are honestly kind of boring. So instead, what I'm gonna do is direct you to our website. There's a lot of different articles on there. One of those articles is a summary of Rich Dad Poor Dad. But yeah, back to the video.
To anyone with even a basic understanding of personal finance today, it's clear that Rich Dad Poor Dad has some good advice and some not so good advice. However, the year was 2000. The internet was just starting to come online, and for many people, Rich Dad Poor Dad was the first time they were ever told that investing your money to make more money is a thing that you can do. Following the astronomical success of Rich Dad Poor Dad, a slew of other books followed. Between 1997 and today, Robert Kiyosaki has authored and co-authored a staggering 32 other titles, with 2 more books slated to come out in 2025 and 2026. Yeah, that's right, he's not done, he's still here. At an average of 1 publication a year, only the likes of Stephen King and Brandon Sanderson are more prolific. Even so, Robert Kiyosaki did more than write. He also made franchisee arrangements, conducted seminars all across the country and beyond, and founded 2 new companies, the Rich Dad Company and Rich Global LLC. It seems that after decades of struggle and hard work, things were finally looking up for Robert Kiyosaki. So where did it all go wrong? The downfall of Robert Kiyosaki's reputation was not something that happened suddenly. Rather, it was a slow tumble down a gentle decline, like a slow mudslide. However, also like a slow mudslide, once the process had begun, there was no stopping its progression. Case Study A, Sharon Letcher's Lawsuit, 2007. Remember that name, Sharon Letcher? She not only co-wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad, but 15 of Robert Kiyosaki's other books as well. However, if you simply Googled one of these titles, all Google will tell you is that Robert Kiyosaki is the author, with no mention of another person involved. But if I looked into old pictures of book covers, there it is, Sharon Letcher. So who am I supposed to believe? In 2007, Sharon Letcher filed a lawsuit against Robert and Kim Kiyosaki, alleging that the two were tucking away company earnings and stiffing her on royalties. The event concluded in an out-of-court settlement. Case Study B, CBC's documentary on Rich Dad Poor Dad seminars. As the popularity of Rich Dad Poor Dad grew, so did the public demand for Robert Kiyosaki's seminars. Franchisees under the Rich Dad Poor Dad brand expanded across America and up into Canada. Soon enough, troubling accusations arose. These seminars are a ripoff, attendees reported, a total scam and waste of money. In 2009, CBC aired a documentary showing just what happened in a Rich Dad Poor Dad seminar.
It's $995 for 3 days of training.
If we act now, it'll only cost us $500. Turns out this free event is really just a sell job for a 3-day workshop.
I would like to have my money back and want to have anything to do with them anymore.
I like the education they put together.
We show our hidden camera tapes to real estate lawyer Bob Aaron.
I'm very angry that somebody like this is pawning off this as advice that he's getting paid for to the Canadian public. And they're going to spend a lot of time and maybe a lot of money only to find out that this doesn't work.
But what these guys are doing, they're not my company, they're a licensee.
How is it not your company?
Well, it's a license of my company, and they're operating, should I say, legally under the auspices of my license.
Let's use Kiyosaki's cash flow game to explain it. The Rich Dad workshops are just Rich Dad by association. Kiyosaki has licensed his brand to a company that, until recently, was called Whitney Information Network. It's been offering get-rich workshops for more than 10 years and has a history of run-ins with regulators and unhappy customers.
I do not like what you're saying, and you're painting it only in one direction.
Well, I don't
And that's
mean
not
for you
fair.
to feel
Okay,
that
that's
you're
not
under
fair.
attack. I'm
No,
just
no,
looking
that's
for
not fair,
answers
ma'am.
from
That's
people
not.
Could it be this savvy businessman didn't do his due diligence?
I'm wondering why Rich Dad would partner with a company with such a checkered past.
I didn't know it at the time when we checked him out.
If that wasn't damning enough, in 2011, news of a class action lawsuit against Rich Dad Poor Dad seminars broke, headed by Robert Crew and Robert Murris. These claims were ultimately dismissed by the court on the grounds that Rich Dad Poor Dad seminars didn't violate any contracts. And yet, despite Robert Kiyosaki being hit with lawsuit after lawsuit, he remained upstanding in the eyes of the general public. Sure, there were dissidents here or there who were caught up in an MLM scam thanks to the Rich Dad Poor Dad brand name, but who cares? Robert Kiyosaki was still publishing books. Robert Kiyosaki was still raking in the dollars. But the cracks in the foundation of the Rich Dad Poor Dad empire was starting to show, and sooner or later, things will come to a head. Case Study C, Rich Global LLC 2012 Bankruptcy. If you've ever heard anything about Robert Kiyosaki's company going bankrupt, chances are it's this company. It's not the first bankruptcy Robert Kiyosaki has experienced, but it certainly was the first he experienced with the internet in full swing. As far back as 2005, Bill Zanker, founder of the New York education company Learning Annex, and Robert Kiyosaki's company, Rich Global LLC, entered into an arrangement. Zanker would help promote Robert Kiyosaki's speaking events in exchange for a % of the profits. Robert Kiyosaki failed to make his payments. Zanker took him to court, and the court ordered Robert Kiyosaki's company, Rich Global LLC, to pay $24 million. The company was not able to make the payment, and thus on August 20th, 2012, Rich Global LLC had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. Suddenly, headlines were popping up everywhere. Rich Dad Bankrupt Dad, Rich Dad Poor Dad's bankrupt company. Enterprising journalists dug even deeper, unearthing Robert Kiyosaki's previous failed business, Ripper, and pre-existing lawsuits. Up until this point, people knew Robert Kiyosaki as that guy who wrote that personal finance book my friend wanted me to read. This was someone the public recognized. This was someone the public thought they could trust. It was a media-feeding frenzy. Case Study D, Connections to MLMs. Now that Robert Kiyosaki has been dragged into the limelight, people started digging more into some of his shadier connections. Even as early as Rich Dad Poor Dad, he wrote in the book, instead of simply working for money and security, which I admit are important, I suggest adults who want to make more money take a second job that will teach them a second skill. Often, I recommend joining a network marketing company, also called multi-level marketing, if they want to learn sales skills. And it's not just Robert Kiyosaki who recommends MLMs. MLMs heavily recommend his books too, often presenting it as required reading for new recruits. Robert Kiyosaki would even go as far as directly promote Amway, one of the first MLM companies, calling them the perfect business, and applying the concepts from his book, Cash Flow Quadrant, co-author Sharon Letcher, to justify their predatory practices. Okay. In fairness to Robert Kiyosaki, MLMs were a new phenomenon at this time, and his willingness to promote Amway likely came from a place of good intention and ignorance. Now, is it acceptable for a personal finance guru with an influence as large as Robert Kiyosaki's to be promoting something so dangerous to millions of people who trust and believe in him? Obviously no. But all this tells us is that Robert Kiyosaki is not that smart. Not that he's malicious. With the gamut of lawsuits, emerged a whirlwind of questions and controversies. Perhaps the biggest question is the identity of Rich Dad. Who is this fabled rich dad who launched the career of the best-known personal finance guru of the modern era? And does he actually exist? Rich Dad Fake Dad? Despite Rich Dad Poor Dad being sold and marketed as non-fiction, Rich Dad, as he exists in the book, is little more than a figment of Robert Kiyosaki's imagination. Sometimes Robert Kiyosaki will say that Rich Dad has passed away. Other times he'll say that Rich Dad is an invalid. The longest enduring excuse is probably that Rich Dad's family asked for confidentiality, and for that reason he can't disclose Rich Dad's identity. In 2002, in an interview with Smart Money magazine, Robert Kiyosaki got tired of the questions and simply said, "Why don't you treat Rich Dad like Harry Potter?" But then, to my surprise, on May 4th, 2016, Alan Kimmey was invited onto the Rich Dad radio show.
So all you guys out there who say, well, there really wasn't a rich dad, and you believe those idiots out there, this is your show, because you're going to find out there really is or was a rich dad. And today we'll be talking to Mike, that was his name in the book, but his real name is Alan. We had to change all of his names and all that. So today's a very special program near the 20th anniversary of Rich Dad. So welcome to the program, Al.
Welcome, Al.
Thank you, Rich Dad Ohana. And thank you, Robert, for inviting me to come on and share some of our history together.
And lessons.
And what I'd like to do is two things. Honor my dad, who's passed away for 6 years now, and who was always very anonymous, because he's a traditional Hawaiian where when there is publicity, what comes with it is jealousy.
So when I wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad, I had to get your agreement, right? That your name was not going to be used. I had to change your name.
Yes, yeah. And no one said anything until it became successful. Then I think 100 people claimed to be Rich Dad.
That's right. They came out of the woodwork, didn't they? Everybody was guessing.
Yeah. So I asked my dad, I said, hey, where are you at? And he says, nope. He said, when I'm gone, it's fine. But while I'm alive, no, I think there's an honor to being anonymous.
Going by Alan Kimmey's recollected stories, I now think that Rich Dad was in fact inspired by Richard Kimmey. Link in the description to an article we wrote on Richard Kimmey if you want to learn more. Even so, Alan Kimmey's anecdotes and the Rich Dad Poor Dad anecdotes are so different. Richard Kimmey and Rich Dad may as well be two entirely different people.
But, Al, you want to tell the story of having us pick up cigarette butts?
Gladly. He didn't have the money to hire a gardener. So he gave each of us an empty can of Folgers, a container. Robert and I, we looked at each other and we said, we're screwed. This is getting harder and harder, and this is BS. 25 cents for 4 hours of work, and we just can't find cigarette butts. So he and I says, I think what we got to do is let's outthink Fada. Let's find out where he's throwing all these cigarette butts. And I said, well, what are we going to do with it? He said, we're going to fill our cans.
But credit where credit is due. Despite many years of public backlash and speculation over the existence of Rich Dad, Robert Kiyosaki stayed true to his agreement with the Kimmeys. 7 years after Richard Kimmey had passed, the world finally learned of the man who inspired Rich Dad. Robert Kiyosaki, actually rich? If Rich Dad's mentorship and Robert Kiyosaki's anecdotes are in question, that only leaves Robert Kiyosaki's own expertise, his own wealth, to justify the advice he gives. So, is Robert Kiyosaki wealthy? Well, here are some facts. I'll let you decide for yourself. 1. His net worth fluctuates from $50 million to $100 million on any given day. according to him, which is highly unusual for a rich person. They generally know how much money they have. 2. Robert Kiyosaki has not had a successful company before the mega success of Rich Dad Poor Dad, and his single successful company is heavily reliant on the Rich Dad brand. 3. As far as accounts online suggest, Rich Dad Poor Dad seminars don't offer anything tangible, whether by way of step-by-step instruction or clear information, which makes you question, does Robert Kiyosaki actually know the steps you should take to be wealthy? 4. If not the business, then surely the real estate. Robert Kiyosaki attributed almost all of his wealth to real estate in Rich Dad Poor Dad, with very little mention of his businesses. John T. Reed, a writer and real estate professional and heavy critic of Rich Dad, states, Robert Kiyosaki has never definitively proven that he owns major real estate, which he really should do considering how much of his wealth supposedly comes from renting out properties. Finally, number 5. Robert Kiyosaki's clearest, most definitive source of income is his books, but even that is a little bit questionable. First of all, despite being marketed as non-fiction, it's pretty clear now that most of the stories and lessons from Rich Dad Poor Dad are blatantly fictional, which kind of makes you wonder, would Rich Dad Poor Dad be as successful as it is if Robert Kiyosaki was truthful about how much of it he made up? As another point, Robert Kiyosaki has had co-authors for nearly all of his books, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with having a co-author. The problem is how little he credits them, and how little he pays them. If Sharon Lecher's lawsuits is anything to go by, Robert Kiyosaki might have very well taken more than his fair share of book royalties. All in all, it doesn't paint a good picture. It makes Robert Kiyosaki look like someone who's willing to do anything to get rich, even take money out of the pockets of his co-workers. And even then, there's no real proof of his actual wealth. Is this really the kind of person whose money advice we want to take? So it really all comes down to this. Is Robert Kiyosaki a fraud? Yes and no. Yes, almost all of Robert Kiyosaki's wealth comes from his books, not his real estate or business. Even so, many people found his books to be bloated and repetitive. Robert Kiyosaki's seminars and books offered no real steps to take, no paths to follow. Despite being a good salesman, Robert Kiyosaki's money managing expertise is every bit as fabricated as his childhood anecdotes. On the other hand, you can argue that Robert Kiyosaki is not a fraud. Rich Dad Poor Dad had some genuine and solid personal finance advice. For example, Robert Kiyosaki warns against lifestyle inflation. He talks about leveraging fear and desire to get the result that you want, being attentive to the way you spend your money. He talks about the importance of looking into options for tax deduction. Now, maybe opening a corporation is not the best idea, but there are other options. For example, IRAs, 401ks, HSAs. Robert Kiyosaki very heavily emphasizes the importance of learning and continuing to learn. That school alone is not enough, and in fact, it can be quite limiting. Robert Kiyosaki talks about converting your money to assets wherever possible. This means, putting down payment on a house or buying stocks, and paying attention to whether your assets are actually generating income. Robert Kiyosaki is also very good at coming up with memorable, snappy turns of phrase.
There is a difference between being poor and being broke. Broke is temporary. Poor is eternal. Learn to use your emotions to think, not think with your emotions. In school, we learn that mistakes are bad, and we are punished for making them. Yet if you look at the way humans are designed to learn, we learn by making mistakes. We learn to walk by falling down. If we never fell down, we would never walk.
At no point did Robert Kiyosaki do anything that bad. He was a terrible boss, if accounts can be believed, but as far as grifters go, Robert Kiyosaki is nowhere near as bad as, say, Dan Lok or Sam Bankman-Fried. Yes, Robert Kiyosaki made up some, okay, all, of the childhood stories from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But it helped people, didn't it? It worked.
He changed from a poor dad to a rich dad and now wakes up every day with a new outlook on life. Here's what Paul's story is. Paul Rogers, a divorced father of two, was making $48,000 a year as a firefighter and living paycheck to paycheck.
By the time I paid the house payment, the child support, the car payment, food and utilities, with the two kids, it was really tough.
Last year, Paul discovered Robert Kiyosaki's financial plan.
He stresses three main things. Number one, set up a home-based business. Number two, get control of your taxes. Number three, take that extra income and buy more assets with it.
He followed the steps and set up his own home-based business. It was easier than he thought and only cost him $300. With that extra income from his new home business and a pay raise from the firehouse of $300 a month, he started to buy homes that were in foreclosure.
You can purchase them under value, go in, carpet, paint them, fix them up, turn and sell them, and even make more money.
With the money he made from selling those houses, Paul bought stocks, mutual funds, IRAs, and even set up an educational account for his children.
It has changed my outlook on life because this has given me more time freedom with my kids and more financial freedom. And the best thing is my income's gone from about $48,000 to a little over $100,000 in a one-year period.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. I bet you're impressed with yourself.
These days, opinions are divided. Some people still trust Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Poor Dad brand. Others see Robert Kiyosaki as a snake oil salesman, an out-and-out MLM grifter.
And it's like, this is very bad advice.
These are also not true. Like, the lawyer worked for free, the real estate agent worked for free, the billboard worked for free. Like, that's not how any of this fucking works. All of that shit costs money.
My rich dad did not see Robin Hood as a hero. He called Robin Hood a crook. This war between the haves and have-nots has been going on for hundreds of years. It is the take from the rich crowd versus the rich.
Fuck this guy. Fuck this guy.
This is the guy we're dealing with here. A conspiracy theorist, an out-and-out capitalist libertarian neck-deep in debt, who regularly calls California communist.
My poor dad was a school teacher. He was also Marxist. Marxist.
But here's the thing. I think Robert Kiyosaki genuinely believes in the things he says. Yes, a good deal of that belief is because his livelihood depends on it, but there's a real conviction there. Rich Dad, Poor Dad is in some ways dangerously misleading. The MLMs are the least of it. Robert Kiyosaki will do his utmost to upsell you on his seminars, from free to $500 to $45,000. Robert Kiyosaki will shamelessly advise that you make friends with rich people so you can do legal insider trading, and tell you to set up a corporation so you can skirt the line of technically legal tax fraud. And you'll find soon enough that among the helpful suggestions from Rich Dad Poor Dad and the motivational quotes lay dangerous advice and philosophical landmines. Poor people deserve to be poor. Academics have no idea what they're talking about. Traditional higher education is for losers. And yet, Rich Dad Poor Dad is the best-selling personal finance book of all time, and for my money, there's a reason for that. In politics, there's something called an Overton window. This means that the public understanding of what's acceptable is determined by the extremes. Robert Kiyosaki is the extreme opinion here. Instead of giving us a reasonable, middling answer to our dissatisfaction with life and work, he gives us the extreme answer. This shifts our personal Overton window, pulling us from our comfortable school, work, house, debt mentality into a more middling perspective. We observe our own life and Robert Kiyosaki's extreme suggestions, and we decide, well, I'm not ready to risk angering the IRS by dodging taxes, but I guess I can look into less shady ways to reduce my tax, like the 401k. Just speaking for myself, Rich Dad Poor Dad is not the first self-help book I've read. That dubious honor goes to The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. By all accounts, The Power of Habit is a much better researched book, with many real-life examples that Rich Dad Poor Dad should have had, but did not. The Power of Habit is a far better and far more scrupulous book than Rich Dad Poor Dad, and yet, it did not persuade me to make a real change in my life. It did not motivate me to visit a bank and set up an automatic dollar cost averaging plan for a broad-based index fund, like Rich Dad Poor Dad. After I read The Power of Habit, my habits did not change. After I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, I left my house and made an investment. In truth, Robert Kiyosaki is a lunatic. But when it comes to the book space, that kind of lunacy might just be what over 40 million people need to improve their lives. Does the millions of people who made real improvements in their lives because of Rich Dad Poor Dad justify the also countless people who were manipulated and exploited by Robert Kiyosaki and the MLMs he's affiliated with? If Rich Dad Poor Dad motivated Andy to get his act together and pay off his $45,000 of debt, does that justify his overpriced seminars tricking Gary into $45,000 of debt? Hard to say. What I think is that since Rich Dad Poor Dad is already published and out there in the world, all we can really do is try our best to warn people about it. That's what this video is about, really. We want to set the record straight and put all the information on the table so you can make your own informed decision. If you allow Robert Kiyosaki to convince you that he's smarter and richer than he actually is, that's when you run into trouble. But as long as you make sure to keep your head on your shoulders and not let Robert Kiyosaki lead you astray, you might just learn a thing or two from him. Thank you for watching. This has been a doozy. If you like this video, please drop a like on your way out. It would really help out this channel. Also, definitely subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Until next time, bye!